he said, in your research, what are the key things you're looking for? I usually focus on pitchers since they are not as variant as hitters and team batting stats. Just want to see other ways of adding value to separate myself from all of these sharp Saber users. Yeah, so here's my plug number 2 of those videos, those strategy sessions we've been talking about lately. The one we did this week, actually, we talked a lot, Max and I talked a lot about actually using SaberSim as your research tool or one of your kind of research providers in the form of running builds that were basically set at something resembling this, where you turn ownership fade off, you turn smart diversity all the way up, right? This is going to give us an image of what actual optimals might look like that could potentially win contests on a given slate, and then let this build. This video, again, I'm not going to be able to go as deep into detail here on office hours into everything we covered in this video. Highly recommend checking it out. It will be in the description of this video once it's up on YouTube. But this actually bears a lot of resemblance to my overall process, right? My personal stance on kind of where I come with my lineups is that I am generally okay taking the assumption that the model is accounting for most things, and my greatest value add is actually looking into opportunities that the model is finding for upside at low ownership, rather than digging into maybe StatCast or other advanced stats or trying to come up with something that the model's not taking into account, right? The model takes into account a great deal of information, more than I can possibly process, and I don't really like to go try to find things that maybe aren't being taken into account. So what my research process literally looks like pretty often is I will run this build, look at my entire pool, and get an idea of what some potential stacks look like for the slate. And you can see here, even just filtering by all, I guess, is fine, right? This is a big 14-game slate. Running this build and looking at optimals here, there are a great deal of teams that the builder is saying are viable tonight. So again, I haven't really started my research process rigorously here for tonight's slate, but what this is indicating to me right off the bat is that almost anything is viable. And there's clearly probably 8 or so teams here that have at least 10% equity here in the top 500 optimals. This would indicate to me that I'm going to be very wary of chalk tonight, right? I don't know how chalky teams are necessarily going to get with 14 games on a slate, but if we get closer to lock and the Padres and the Twins and the Dodgers and some of these other teams with high run totals are starting to look like they're going to be very chalky, I'm probably going to find some leverage by going to some of these other teams here and starting to get some extra exposure to some of the other teams that are showing up in this build, right? If you are unsure exactly how to do that, I would recommend watching the video from last week, the 5 styles or strategies of winning DFS players, and watching that video and seeing how you can edit projections or exposures or ownership to start really dialing in your builds and nailing down your individual process, right? So again, I want to keep hammering home the point. Those 2 videos, they pair very well together. You've got video 1 here being the why, how to know maybe what are some teams that have some additional upside versus the how, right? Editing your projections, editing your exposures, and things like that. I see Andrew followed up by saying, how do you know if they're going to look chalky as we get closer to lock? Are we looking at Vegas line movement, ownership projection changes? Yeah, this is a little bit of a mixed bag here. I would say one of those things that is great to look at is the ownership projections, right? Keeping an eye on what potentially chalky teams look like throughout the day here. So we can just see what we're looking at right now, right? And some of this, honestly, can just be a matter of just quick glance, right? I think some of the teams that are already popping here in particular are the Dodgers, Philly, Minnesota, right? These are teams that look like they're going to be chalky. I love this. I've brought this up. It's been a little while since I've actually see Labs, MLB Vegas. Let me see if I can. So Fantasy Labs has this Vegas dashboard. This is another thing I look at. I find that the field just consistently over gravitates to teams that have the highest run totals, especially if there's far and away one team that starts to get a run total that is pretty high up there. I expect that team to be the chalkiest team on the slate. There's honestly really not, I think, even in this particular case, right, if the Twins are at like a 6.0 run total around lock, I would expect that they're disproportionately chalky compared to the rest of the teams on the slate. We also talked about this chalk build here, where you can run basically a cash build where you force a 5 stack. And we'll run this and get an idea of what the chalkiest construction is likely to be on a slate. I think this can be really useful. Some of this also you can follow along on like social media. If you follow kind of some other DFS content providers, to be completely honest, and YouTube and things like that, and just see who's getting touted, really. A lot of that pick content that you find out there is specifically designed to be very safe, right? The players and the plays that typically get touted are very safe plays, right? People don't want to be wrong, and they especially don't want to publicly come out and say, I'm on this team tonight, and pick a team that isn't the most likely to have a ceiling outcome, right? So that's another tool that can be useful. As we see here, right, it's looking like probably Philadelphia and Minnesota are the chalky constructions that we think are going to be popular, paired with Snell and then one of these more salary relief type pitchers. So some of this is also a little bit of intuition, right? I think as you get familiar with playing baseball DFS and looking at what ownership ends up doing, especially on certain slates, it can be very useful. You can get a feeling. That's where I've kind of gotten a lot of my personal intuition about this, right? Where I'm saying things like, if I notice one team is just the highest projected run total team on the slate, I think they're going to be over-owned. Right? I think that's a little bit of learned intuition that I've gained from playing baseball DFS for years here, and just also in particularly this season. You can kind of get a feeling for that. So, but I guess long story short, right? What our upside build or our max smart diversity build here implied to us is that there's a lot of different options here on the slate. So I am pretty much just looking to play anything that I think might be potentially a little less popular. And that's kind of what my process looks like. I know, Andrew, you mentioned in the original comment here that you usually focus on pitchers. I think that's totally fine. I think you can kind of take a similar approach to pitching. One thing I will say, let's go ahead and look at our pitchers. So it's a pretty spread out pool at pitching as well tonight. I think part of that comes with the fact that our most expensive pitcher on the slate is somehow Jake Odorizzi. This isn't a particularly awesome pitching slate. I actually think this makes this all a pretty fun slate. There's actually a lot of different routes you can go. I think in general, you'll find that pitching ends up being a little more condensed for the same reasons we were talking about before, right? Pitchers are a little less volatile. Chalk ends up tending to be a little bit better at pitching. Obviously, a bit ironic here, making that statement after Scherzer and Darvish both got completely lit up last night as like the two chalkiest pitchers on the slate. But they are a little less volatile. I like to focus my overall strategy around the hitting stacks, and I will kind of typically take a little bit of what SaberSim wants to give me with the pitchers, especially once I start to dial in my exposures for hitting stacks. But that's kind of a little bit about what my process overall looks like, what my research process looks like. And I know you did mention to want to see other ways of adding value to separate myself from all these sharp Saber users. Two things on that. One, because of the way smart diversity works, in individually pulling a set of game sims out for every single lineup, you are very unlikely to ever really duplicate any other SaberSim user. And if you follow this overall strategy, we talked about it a little bit in yesterday's office hours too. There are so many different conclusions that you can draw from running this kind of build and seeing where opportunities for upside are, right? Yesterday on the show, we talked about how running a build like this might lead one user to realize that there was value in certain stacks that are likely to be under-owned, right? Like one team actually that's popping out for me here, I guess three, above 10% would be KC, New York, and Detroit. Those might be teams that I'm somewhat interested in because they're not on that list of those high projected total teams on the dashboard, right? Or are they? I'm curious. So many games on the slate tonight. So Detroit is like a very interesting one. This isn't the most inspiring line movement for Detroit, but it is interesting that the builder thinks there's 10% viability, and it's probably on the it's probably on smaller stacks, right? But the builder obviously sees that there's some upside potential for Detroit on a slate like this. The Yankees were another one. Curious what their total is. This dashboard's not the easiest to use because these things don't like scroll at the same speed. But overall, my point is that you could run this kind of build and draw a very different set of conclusions from another user running the exact same build and end up attacking the slate in very different ways, both in ways that capture upside, capture variance, capture ownership, and things like that.